Everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Scrubbed In Show. I hope you've all been keeping well. This week, we're joined by Daly, who is the CEO and founder of Skin Analytics, which I'm sure many of you already know are doing incredible work. I've just been looking through the website and some of their stats, which is impressive to say the least. Working with over 20 NHS hospitals and trusts, served over 120,000 people. And the most impressive of all, obviously from our standpoint, is kind of being recognized and approved as a Class IIa AI as a medical device, and really making real impact when it comes to skin cancer pathologies and kind of helping kind of uplift the backload. Lots to talk about, but it's an absolute pleasure to have you here on the show today, Neil. How are you?
Welcome to the show.
Thanks, guys. Yes, very well. And it's a pleasure to be on your show. I'm really looking forward to our chat.
So we know you're doing incredible work with Skin Analytics, but we really want to go back into kind of the early days of your career. I'm not sure many of our listeners will know, but you're a non-clinician, entered the world of healthcare, health tech, and you actually had a background in strategy consulting, which is funny because a lot of clinicians are going into strategy consulting right now, and a lot of strategy consultants are coming into the world of healthcare. So kind of keen to talk about the early phase of your career and kind of this journey into the world of healthcare.
Yeah, absolutely. I think from my perspective, I worked in technology consulting and then strategy consulting. And my background was in maths and physics. And so I realized that I wasn't smart enough to do either of those things professionally. So I went into consulting, which is what people do when they're not smart enough to do the thing that they studied. And it was actually very fascinating because I got to play around with industries that were being disrupted by technology. So specifically, I started and did a lot of work in the banking sector, and technology was coming along, and the whole banking system had to fundamentally change from being a bricks and mortar business to being a digital business, and that caused a lot of pain, and there was a lot of pushback, and there were people who moved quickly and did well, and there were people who moved slowly and dropped behind, and that was just so much fun to be involved with. And then I was lucky enough to get onto a project working with Johnson & Johnson, looking at diabetic monitoring and seeing if you could do continuous diabetic monitoring and start to do predictive analytics. And the project didn't go anywhere. It only lasted for a short period of time. But I got the first insight into the healthcare system and was just completely fascinated on how chaotic it is. I think the patients are looking for one thing, you've got doctors looking for another thing, you've got the people who pay for the system who consider something else, and you've got the regulatory bodies, you've got the people like NICE, and it's just in the middle of all of that is the chaos of healthcare delivery. Yeah. It's amazing that it actually works as well as it does when you've got all those different opinions in there. But I was just absolutely fascinated by it. And so from that moment onwards was only ever going to do something in healthcare.
Amazing.
When you were exposed to the world of healthcare, right, as someone standing on the outside, how do you start actually sort of untangling all of those complexities? So now you're looking for domain sort of insight and getting that experience right. How do you get that?
Yeah, well, I get this question a lot, and there's a sense that doctors should be more at the heart of health technology, and I think they definitely should, and actually are, to be honest with you. We've got a whole bunch of doctors that work in our team and have always worked with clinicians. But at the same time, what we are actually doing with a lot of health technology businesses is starting to look at the healthcare system much more from a population health perspective. And until recently, and I think still now, clinicians aren't getting a lot of training about population health and thinking about health system design. They're focused on getting the best outcome for patients and figuring out that really complex clinical interaction between humans and finding out how to get the best outcomes for them. And that's very different from what you are doing when you are trying to design a health technology business, or you're trying to do what we're doing, which is sort of improve skin cancer survival rates. And so I wasn't really that far on the outside, if you like. I think the clinicians had a smaller step to take, but they still had to take a step to be able to understand our business. And likewise, I had to take a big step into the healthcare system. But I had plenty of time to go and speak to lots of people and assimilate the information. And that's one good thing about consulting, is you spend a lot of your time asking questions and assimilating information. So I was pretty comfortable making that transition. And I guess the final part of this is, without upsetting any clinicians, it's the most hierarchical business that I've ever seen. And that once you become the senior clinician, you're given almost carte blanche to make decisions in a way that typically doesn't happen in any other industry. And so there is some value of coming from outside of the system and saying, hey, why are you doing it this way? Well, I'm doing it this way because I was trained to do it this way, and we always have done it this way. That's not a really good answer, or that won't satisfy someone coming from outside of the system. And so that probably was a bit of an advantage, I have to be honest.
That's
absolutely
interesting. And I like the perspective non-clinicians bring to the industry or healthcare. They see things through a different lens. They see the inefficiencies, and they kind of focus on kind of how to make a difference. I'm keen to kind of hear kind of the early days of skin analytics. Like, the human body healthcare is so big and vast. Why skin cancer? Why go down this thing? What did the first few days look like? Did you have co-founders? Who were the first people you brought on? Because I think that's where a lot of the fun is in the journey, and obviously a lot of the obstacles as well.
Yeah, well, so why skin cancer? You can probably hear I'm Australian originally. And if we're good at one thing that isn't sport, it's making skin cancer. Something like
Yes.
2/3 of all Australians are going to have skin cancer in their lifetime. We're just really good at making it because we've got all the sort of holes in the ozone layer above Australia for so long. So we grow up hyper aware of it. I remember not being allowed on the playground without having a hat and sunglasses as a kid going through school. And we're also a population that loves the sunshine and loves being outside. And so, there's just a lot of awareness of skin cancer in Australia. And so when I was trying to think through what I wanted to do, and I was thinking about moving into the healthcare space, I had this foundational understanding of computer vision from my maths and physics training. And I was really excited about what this image-based AI systems or computer vision systems back then could do. It felt like a very natural step. I cared about healthcare. I wanted to do something that mattered to me. I had enough information or background to be dangerous about what artificial intelligence could do. And it just sort of all came together as the more I thought about it, the more having something that could visually diagnose skin cancer made a lot of sense. And so it just felt right. And I just kept going and built momentum. And that's how we ended up focusing on skin cancer. But the first days were interesting. The first days really were about going around and trying to convince two groups at the same time that were going to be important to us, that what I was trying to get off the ground wasn't a ridiculous idea. And the first group were the clinicians, and trying to convince them that some computer could come in and make a difference to the way skin cancer was diagnosed or found was actually very, very difficult. And then the second group was the computer scientists, and I went around to all the universities and spoke to the professors of computer science, and most of them said, this is ridiculous, don't bother. And then one of the guys, one of the professors I spoke to, a guy called Bill Fitzgerald, who unfortunately passed away some time back, but it was up in Cambridge, and he said, hey, this sounds like a lot of fun, let's give it a go. And that was really the start of the company when I had him behind us. The clinicians, it took a little bit more time to convince, and actually led to us taking the first misstep of many in growing this business. So I started the business with the idea of doing skin cancer diagnostics. And then when I managed to get a bunch of clinicians to come on board and give some advice, and we found some skin cancer experts who were willing to give us some of their time very, very generously. But they were very clear to me that I shouldn't focus on diagnostics. I should focus on detecting change over time, because that's what really matters for patients to monitor themselves. And so we built that, and we did a really good job of detecting change over time. We took a bit of a diversion from in the company. We lost a couple of years. And then when we tried to go and commercialize it, we had two problems. One, patients didn't really care enough to track things over time proactively. And two, clinicians didn't care enough about it to actually get people to try and use it way back then. And one of the problems was the NHS GP had no way of booking someone into a 3-month follow-up appointment. And so they were like, well, how good is this? I'm going to send this patient home, tell them to monitor their skin lesion. If anything changes, what are they going to do? They have to book their own appointment? No, this is all too hard. And so we built something that no one actually cared about in the end. And that was a very painful lesson. And we had to go back to diagnostics and sort of course correct. But it was a really interesting way to start the business and sort of bringing those two different expert groups in.
Which is interesting. And I think that's why it's so important to be close to the problem and speak to the stakeholders. And I think, it's cliche now in the sense that you need innovation that's adopted for it to really scale and have impact. Tell us a bit more about kind of the AI side of things. So, back then, a lot of companies pretended to be AI, and then they weren't really. It's more like decision tree making, and you weren't probably going this. how integral was AI and how has that evolved to where you are now? And the other question that I wanted to ask was, I have this feeling of the academics who've done real research in the space tend to build the bigger, better companies and kind of the people that are spinning it off with not much kind of domain insight and knowledge when it comes to AI and regulation. So those are two things I want to kind of pick out from this.
Yeah, just one comment to the past point. I think it was really interesting early on to try and pick out who to listen to when you go and ask to start a company. You have to be smart enough to listen to the people who are telling you important stuff, but then you have to be dumb enough not to listen to the people who are telling you important stuff that's not going to help you. And that was something I definitely struggled with. But in terms of the artificial intelligence, you are 100%. When I started the business, it was actually, like I said, we called it computer vision. No one was talking about it back then. And then I remember in 2014 having a conversation with the team about how we're going to rebrand ourselves to be an AI business, because everyone was talking about AI finally. And I mean, we didn't change anything about the business. We just started calling ourselves an AI business rather than a computer vision business. But at that time, everyone it were things like drones, blockchain and AI were the things that you put in your pitch deck. And if you put all three in, then you were going to definitely get funded. But there was a lot of people saying AI is driving this, AI is driving that, when it really wasn't AI. It was sort of decision trees, as you mentioned. And we weren't smart enough to realize that AI was so marketable. We knew it was what people were interested in. We didn't realize or weren't outwardly focused enough to really try and differentiate what we were doing from what other people were doing. So we were probably slow to realize that as a core AI first business, we probably should have made more noise about that earlier on. But it was I guess we were so early. There's been 3 waves of AI, and we're now into the 3rd one, which has got a lot more momentum and delivering real scale size businesses. But we were really lucky to be so early, because in healthcare, the foundational elements you need to build, from the artificial intelligence itself, the technology has to be built from the ground up, specific to the problem you're solving. But then also all of the clinical evidence and all of the regulatory architecture you need to put in place just take significant amounts of time. So I feel like we were very lucky to have started the business so long ago and have the time to build those really strong foundations. And many other companies that are coming along now are trying to retroactively build those foundational elements, and it just doesn't work very well. It's a very hard lift for them.
So in terms of the trends, right, human behavior, I mean, with all of this AI now in the consumer space as well, what's the discussion been like in your space? How has it affected your company? So ChatGPT, right, it came out, everyone's using it. How's it affected your company and the discussions doctors, patients, and you guys are having internally as well?
So I have to be careful how I say this, because people on our team will think about this differently. I think from our perspective, the large language model explosion has been unbelievably positive for us. And I'll explain why in a second. But there's I think a sense that this is finally delivering on artificial intelligence in a way that companies before, like what we do, haven't been. And that frustrates some of our AI team and researchers here, because foundationally what they do is so valuable, and that the large language models are almost predictive in terms of they're predicting the next words and how things work. There's not a lot of reasoning going on there. And you could argue it's a sort of some degree a step back in terms of complexity of output from where we were. But it is so much more useful day to day than across so many different applications than the image-based stuff has been in the past. And so it's been a huge shift of attitudes for people who are very skeptical about artificial intelligence to people being much more willing to believe in it. I've been shouting about this for 12 years now, about how this AI system can diagnose skin cancer as good as a dermatologist, and we've got data now that suggests the performance is actually a little bit higher, and no one believed me. And I could put clinical studies in front of people, and then I could put real world evidence in front of people, and no one would believe me. And then overnight, ChatGPT comes out, and people are able to, say, write me a poem about dogs, and it could do it instantly. And people are like, oh my God, this AI thing works. Maybe it can diagnose cancer. And then all of a sudden, every time we spoke to someone, they started to believe that it could do all of these things that we've been saying could for a long time. but it was the usability of these large language models to let people play with it to start to get some sense of the power of AI that has
Yeah.
really dramatically changed everyone's opinions.
Yeah. I think
Amazing.
what ChatGPT did, because LLMs have been around for a while prior to that, is kind of it was a UX UI play. It's that human interaction with this chatbot that felt almost human like. I want to kind of talk about a bit further along the journey. You've kind of had the idea of skin cancer, very familiar with it, grew up with it. What came first? Was it kind of convincing clinicians, hospitals to get the data to train the models on? Because we know all of these platforms and software is only as good as the data sets they're trained on. Or was it kind of a pilot? What came first? How was that process looking like? And at what point did you need to start considering regulations and approvals, which is a bit of a ball ache on its own, right? But super, super needed. So if you don't mind sharing that part of the journey.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that we did very well was lean into regulations very early.
Okay.
So we've had a full-time regulatory part of our team for 6-7 years now.
Nice.
And our regulatory director sits on our management team. So we have right intrinsically into the way we run our company, regulations at the heart of it. And I think that that's been an important thing for us. And I think the earlier you lean into it, the earlier you understand the implications of it, the earlier that you start to build your business around the structures that are required to meet those regulations is essential. And what I mean is, you guys operate in the clinical world, and in the clinical world, there's a very fixed way of doing things to make sure you've got all clinical safety at the heart of everything you do. Well, the same thing goes for a medical device company. You need to have very fixed procedures about how you build technology, how you validate it, how do you surveil it post-market, and how do you build all these elements into a company. You can't, this is what I was saying about retrofitting it. It's very difficult to go back and put these processes in place and then make sure that every person in the company understands that these processes are how you run the business. That's not how startups typically run. And so the earlier that you get into this process and that you realize that as a regulated company, you have to operate like that, the better you can build that sort of culture of quality that you need to be a health tech business. And so, I think that that's something that was hugely important for us. But if we're talking about even before we got to that regulatory part, how did we get started? Because we were so early, we were a little bit lucky in many respects. And that's because radiology is all digitized. Everything's been digitized for a long time. Dermatology is not. And even now, where there's been a very strong push in the UK, which is more so than many other markets, to move to teledermatology, where it's digitized to some degree, still less than 40% of the NHS is using teledermatology. And so a lot of it is not digitized. And so the data sets, as you pointed out, they're not very good. And when they've been collected for a specific reason. So a dermatologist might say, hey, I want to take this image because this is a bit weird. I've not seen something like this before. And then if you get those data sets and you try and train an algorithm, you're missing out so much of what skin cancer dermatology is that it's not terribly helpful. So because it wasn't digitized, our job was that much harder. And that gave us the advantage of having to be smarter about the networks that we built. When we started playing around with deep learning, the idea with deep learning is you need millions of images or at least hundreds of thousands. And we built our first version with like 10,000, maybe slightly less. But we had to go back to first principles and build the technology stack from the ground up so that we could work with those smaller data sets. And we chose to work with small, high quality data sets rather than larger. And specifically, I mean, so we had histopathology labeled data rather than a larger data set that we could have gathered, which was dermatologist labeled. And we wanted the ground truth to be histopathology. And that meant the data sets were much smaller. And it meant that we had to work very hard to get that to work for us. But that was foundational for the business that we've built because we've been tailoring the AI specifically to the problem for so long. And I guess the second advantage of being so early and there not being a large digital data set is that we reached out to dermatologists all around the world and started collecting data from them, and people were happy to share because we were so early on the scene. And so we collected these really great diverse data sets from around the world that weren't that representative. But then when we started running commercial services, and we've been doing teledermatology since 2015, we started layering in much more real world data on the top. And then when you combine those two things, where you had the hard, weird cases, and then you had the much more general other cases, we were able to get this really powerful data set that was unique to us. And so that was really the first step, was getting that, showing that the technology worked, we ran a bunch of clinical studies to prove that the technology could perform. In the same time, we were running the analog version, as I call it, the dermatologist AI teledermatology services in the background. And then we were able to take that step into an AI pathway in and around when COVID happened.
Yeah, amazing.
Right.
Tell us, when it comes to scaling, what are the things that allowed kind of the adoption of kind of derm and skin analytics? Was it cost savings? Was it helping with the backlog? Was it kind of the dermatologist pushing for it? Because as you know, with healthcare, the end users are very different to the payers, who are very different to the stakeholders, and it's someone that's very detached, that's kind of authorizing it in a procurement department. So tell us a bit more about the challenges of actually getting it into hospital, getting paid for it, and not stuck on these kind of free pilots, how you're kind of pitching skin analytics.
Yeah, so the very first service we launched, as I mentioned, was the service that ran through private insurance companies. And it was a remote teledermatology service that evolved over time, but it came out in 2015. And what the proposition with Vitality Health that were the first to ever deploy us, what resonated with them was a customer experience story. So they already, way back in 2015, were already struggling to get private dermatology appointments for their customers, and the time to get those appointments were taking quite a long time for the pain that the patients felt. You know, when you think you've got cancer, which is quite often when it's a funny lesion that's completely fine, but as a layperson, you think you've got cancer, waiting 2 weeks to see a dermatologist, which it was back then, it's much longer now, feels like the longest 2 weeks of your life, because you're sure you're going to die, and then the dermatologist looks at it and within 10 seconds says, "Now you're fine." But for those 2 weeks, you're convinced that it's all over. And so what Vitality was really attracted to was this idea of running this virtual pathway where the patient got the answer within a day. And we had a fantastic user experience, and we had fantastic clinicians working with us. We got them answers sometimes within minutes of them submitting the photos.
Wow.
I remember getting a call from a patient on a Sunday night about 8:30, and they said, "There's been some mistake. Your system's not worked because I submitted the photos." This is back when it was only dermatologists. "I submitted photos and I got a dermatologist report within a minute, and so there must be some mistake." And I looked into the case for them and said, "No, Dr. So-and-so reviewed your case and
Incredible.
results." And they were like, mind blown. This is the greatest thing ever. So that was the main reason. There is a very handy sort of cost avoidance for the private insurance companies as well. It's just more efficient to do teledermatology than it is to do face-to-face. And so there's like a bunch of benefits. The NHS is completely different. And while there is always a need to have in-year cost savings for innovations you want to roll into the NHS, the need in the NHS was much more fundamental than that. And it's just simply the supply-demand mismatch between the people who needed dermatology care and the number of dermatologists we have to deliver that care. And that was starting to create backlogs, and 2-week wait as it was the metric back then, which has obviously been replaced. But the 2-week wait performance numbers were really bad for hospitals. And they were really struggling to figure out, how do we deal with this volume that we can't see? And that real fundamental need was the thing that got people across the line. In the end, we started setting up with University Hospital Birmingham, which was our first ever partner. And they had a really great executive there called Nick Barlow, who really got into the idea of how can we use these AI to build these better pathways. And then while we're having these discussions, COVID hit, and we took something that we were planning to sort of build out in 3 months and launch in 3 months, and we went from idea to launch in 6 weeks. And
Amazing.
The kicker for COVID was almost everyone who goes down an urgent skin cancer pathway is a healthy human being. And there's only a small percentage of them that have cancers. They're the last people you want to go into a hospital that was one of the hardest hit with COVID. And so the idea was we could set up these satellite clean sites, if you like, which out of the hospital that we could collect the data from, that allowed patients to stay away from where the COVID was and still continue to run a dermatology service. And AI was at the heart of that. And that really accelerated that deployment. And the rest is history, I guess. That was our first deployment.
Neil, 2 questions here. So going back to the when you were part of the insurance systems, right? There was a supply and demand essentially. So you needed the dermatologists, and then you got the insurance, right? How did you, at that point, convince and get enough sort of critical mass of doctors? What was the incentive for them? Was it the user experience for them, or was it the payments, being able to stay on top of clinical sort of workload? And the second question is, with the deployment in the NHS, right? Founders often want to know, how did you get that first meeting though? Was it a cold email? Was it a friend of a friend who said, "Yeah, I know him. You can maybe have a coffee with him if you're able to reveal that, of course. So yeah,
Absolutely.
if you could go into how did the first sort of door open up for you?
Yeah, happy to do it. So in terms of recruiting the clinicians first, again, we did this so early in 2015. There was actually no one doing teledermatology, and so I think the clinicians we work with, a great bunch, and they were just genuinely interested in delivering care more efficiently and had an interest
Oh,
in
nice.
dermatology, and were obviously dermatologists, but were interested in the ability to get high quality dermoscopy images and being able to make those decisions remotely. And the system started a little bit more simply, where it was basically, can I triage this person out? And if I have any doubt, I'll call them in. And so that was a very simple start for a clinician with very low risk, but very effective for a lot of folks. And so we were lucky to be able to get a handful of people to report for us. I guess the other part to it was it became quite lucrative for them, because the average time through the case, we would really optimize how much time they would need to spend to give their clinical decision. And they could very simply have something that they could scale up or down depending on their interest, private capacity, without having to go set up a private clinic. And what was interesting to me is there's a huge number of dermatologists that work across the UK that don't want to work privately. They give all their time to the NHS, even though they know they could make a significant amount more privately. And these folks were probably in that bucket. But having a little bit of supplementary private income was quite nice for them. But they spent all of their time with the NHS, and so this could be very quick and easy. They could do in the evenings. They could do around lunchtime, whenever they felt was appropriate. And so it just became a very nice lifestyle step for them. Initially, and then it's sort of grown its own momentum. In terms of getting the first start, it was really hard. It was really hard. I think it's really hard because it's not the same anywhere. All of the NHS organizations that all have the same name, but are just 500, 600 different companies with the same name. They all set up differently. The person that you need to speak to is different. It was difficult to find our way through. We had loads of conversations. We'd go to conferences, we'd meet people, we'd reach out to service managers, we'd reach out to dermatologists. In the end, we were lucky in that the executive I mentioned, Nick Barlow, he was tasked by the chief exec of UHB at the time to just go out and figure out how to make digital work. Let's get digital, whatever it is, set up in the hospital and prove that there's value here. Pick a handful of digital interventions that we want to do. And so he was given that remit, and he was very, very capable person who was able to go out and execute. And so he actually approached us at a conference. And then it moved at an incredibly quick pace after that. But we've been doing outreach for so long and not really getting anywhere. So, I think the NHS is better organized now, but it was hard work.
Thank you so much for sharing that, because I think we all hear deployments, this, that, and the other, and it sounds like, oh, they must have got it in like one cold email. So you just sharing that really puts it into perspective. Like it's usually a long road, a challenging road, and sometimes it's the right place, right moment, right conference.
Absolutely,
that does it.
And to give you some color as well, I think after we got the first one, as a venture-backed business, our job is to build up a strong pipeline, to grow strongly, and the UK needs to really adopt and embrace venture-backed businesses, because that's where you can get external investors to come and fund great innovations that can transform the NHS. But in any case, one of the steps along being a venture-backed business is trying to build a very reliable, repeatable sales process. And so we started bringing in like an enterprise sales model, which involves having people who cold email, cold call, and their job is to basically just try and write things. You must have hundreds of them in your inbox. Everyone does these days. Try and get you to bite and respond. And that just did not work for us. It was a disaster. Really good people who worked really hard for us. So it wasn't the people problem, it was a process problem. And at the end of the day, the NHS does not like being sold to. You need to build up relationships. And I think if there's one takeaway for people who are thinking about starting a business that's going to be working with NHS, is be really clear that you're going to have to invest in these relationships and get to know people and get experts, not necessarily clinicians, not necessarily people who work in the NHS, but people who've been working around the NHS that know how to have those conversations, know that they have to be giving as much as taking when interacting with NHS folks. And it just takes a bit of experience, I think.
And one sort of secret I'm going to ask from you is, what is the best way to engage customers in healthcare? Is it cold emails? Is it conferences? Is it getting onto a health-related accelerator for the early stage founders? What's the best way in?
Data and experts, KOL. So
Nice.
you need to find the person who cares about what you do. You find the advocate for you. Clinical, operational, whatever it is that's your area, you've got to find an advocate within an NHS site that cares enough to want to talk to people about it. And then you've got to collect the data that they need. If it's about prioritizing, patient bookings so that you don't have DNAs, you need that expert. If it's a clinical thing, you need to have the clinical expert. You need to have the operations manager. You need to get the people on side that care enough about it. That is the secret sauce, I think, within the NHS.
That's quite interesting. You mentioned that
Golden.
even DNAs. We had a Ben from Deep Medical last week. I think one of the key things that startup founders need to do more, especially in the world of healthcare, is kind of this real world evidence generation. Kind of, this is a new platform software, AI powered tool. This is the evidence. This is what it does, and I think adoption will be a lot better. And I wanted to kind of bring this onto the next part of the podcast. And you mentioned already. Tell us about the challenges of fundraising kind of in the environments. COVID was a great time, recently wasn't so great. A VC-backed businesses. How was that journey? How was that process? And what advice do you have? And the other question, in a few of the WhatsApp groups was your thoughts around hospitals kind of getting equity, helping with the initial pilots, getting some skin in the game. So those are two things I'm quite interested to hear your thoughts around.
Yeah, well, I'm going to have to be honest and not say what I wish I could say, which is, look, being a venture-backed business in the UK is about having a business case around the NHS, and that is not what any venture capitalist wants to see. They hate any NHS business case. They're littered with failures, and I wish it wasn't true, because the NHS is exceptionally good, despite its reputation, at being really early at adopting or fostering, rather than adopting, fostering innovation. So the AI fund, bit of a failure, because what's come out of that AI fund? Versus, if you think about it objectively, the NHS pumped cash into identifying AI that could solve a bunch of problems for them. They validated in a really smart way. Okay, we're going to get the ones that we believe in, and we went through this program. We're going to help them get some real world clinical deployments, and we're going to evaluate the data that came out of it. Brilliant. No one else was doing it. World leader in it. But then they got to the end of it, and it's like, okay, what now? We don't know what now. We don't know how to get this adopted. We don't know how to get site B to pick this up. We don't know how to, and we stopped. No one was paying attention to it. No one was tasked with that job. And all of the innovations that came out the other side had this great evidence, but were left on their own to try and figure out how to sell into an NHS. There was no policy made. There was no, it was just such a shame. And because of that, there's been a lot of failures of venture investments in this space, which has made venture investors very, very reluctant to want to wade into NHS business model businesses. And so if you don't have a credible path outside of the NHS to other markets, then it becomes very, very difficult. So our funding journey, we do have venture involved in our business, and we've been very fortunate with our partners, and we're out at the moment raising another round, and that's going quite well at the moment, based on the growth that we've been able to show over this last year. And it's been very, very positive. But it's still, when I say, something like 80% of our revenue comes from the NHS, people are like, oh, really, the NHS? Well, I don't know how comfortable are we with that. And so, I think it's a bit of a problem that we really need to fix as the UK. We have to figure this one out, because the NHS has been really good at fostering that innovation. It shed this reputation of being impossible to work with, so that we can continue to get private investors to fund the future of our healthcare system, which they're happy to do, as long as they can see a path for getting that return. And I think that's been slightly problematic. Slightly problematic. I'm all about skin in the game. We want skin in the game everywhere. No, look, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because when you're thinking about who comes onto your cap table, you need to be very deliberate about that. So, for example, if you want to operate into the insurance market, do you want to have an insurance provider that's seen as competitive with others on the cap table? Now, the NHS doesn't do that. They're not competitive. And so the question really is, that's unanswered at this point, is that a positive, negative, or no one cares, having the NHS on the cap table? And I think it's probably going to be a little bit of no one really cares. It's not seen as a positive, but it's not a negative. And in which case, I'm all for it, because I think that the NHS does and needs to do more of put money into businesses that are doing the things that matter to them, that solve them problems, and to try and not pick winners commercially, but pick areas that they want to see be successful, and not be afraid to say, well, we've done a market search, we think this company does what we need it to do, we're going to take a little bit of equity and try and help them, whether that's however that equity gets paid for, whether it's services or capital, and not tie their own hands for future competition, but also reap some of the benefits of working with a company that's solving a problem that they have, because that's a way for them to offset the cost in terms of the investments they need to make. So we've never had an explicit conversation about equity from the NHS, and we'd definitely be open to it if they wanted to explore something like that. But again, you can't just give equity; it needs to be people who paid for it tend to want it to be paid for, or something equivalent to come out of it. But I don't think I think it's a trend that the NHS should be less scared about doing. And definitely, I'd be supportive of seeing more of it.
Conversation we've been having with founders recently is kind of around design partnerships and pilots, and kind of assessing the intent if the NHS or an organization is going to pay for your product or software, and how to kind of validate that. Because, there's been stories of founders spending months and months in moving goalposts, and they never really got to convert to a contract or anything like that. Even having a conversation this morning around this, what is your stance on that, or what's a good way for founders to navigate? And my concern is a lot of founders are sometimes a bit desperate to get their ideas into the hand of somewhere, into a hospital. So any insights or advice around that?
Yeah, well, at the end of the day, one thing that you can't forget as a founder is your job is not just to get your technology deployed. Your job is to get your technology deployed in a way that gets you the next round of funding that allows you to continue to grow the business, to get to the scale that you can realize your ambition. And that you can't realize your ambition just based on people using the technology if they're not willing to pay for it, and you're not willing. The validation to get the NHS to use something is one thing. The validation an investor will want to see to believe that they should put more money in it and you can return that investment is a different thing. And you need to balance that out. So getting a deployment where you're covering all the costs from an investor point of view, if you give something away for free, people will use it. There's not a lot of proof point there. If you're doing it in a way that gets you health economic outcomes or clinical outcomes, well, then there's value creation there. So you just need to make sure that you're very mindful of what does the company get out of this? What does the partner get out of this? And then how do you leverage that to get the next deal where it's paid for, so that you can show that growth that becomes backable from a venture investor. And I think it's very easy to get caught into the trap of, it's very easy for an NHS site to do some research, whether it's a full research project or it's we're going to trial this thing for a little bit of time. It's a lot harder for an NHS site to then agree to sign up to that, to be scaled up outside of it. So I think starting those conversations as part of that initial sale, if you like, to do the research, is a really important part of getting those discussions going. But without real world data of how your system performs, it is very difficult to get the NHS to adopt it. So you just have to do it at some point.
Knowing what you know now, if you were starting again from scratch, 0 to 1, what are the first 3 things you would do as a founder?
Not launch a healthcare business.
We all say that.
We all founders say the same.
Well, certainly all health tech founders. I think that the reality is that there is a higher bar and a more intensive capital outlay for a health tech business. That means that being a health tech founder is a vocation rather than, you don't just want to be a founder, you're committed to healthcare. And that's true for everyone that I know that's been successful. It's true for us as well. So there's definitely easier ways to start a business. But what are the 3 things I would do where we did really well? The first one is I would assemble the same team I did, which is an AI expert to help build out the model, a clinical expert to help get that into research shape, a regulatory expert to start building the process and systems that are needed, and then a commercial expert to start the conversations about how do we embed this into the health system to drive that value. And putting those essential building blocks in place, that's the first thing that I do. And that's the first step. I think the second one is I would raise more money, I think, than we did. So we've we've gone out in a number of rounds, and it was because we're very early on in the scene and no one knew, including us, what we were doing and what the right way to do it was. We've kind of had to do everything for the first time, I guess, in many respects. And so we've done that without a lot of money, and it's meant that we've begged, borrowed, and stolen in many respects to get where we've gotten. And so I think getting a little bit of extra capital, but not too much, because we've been very lean and that's been very good for us. But getting extra capital to be able to do some things in parallel that we did in series would be really helpful. And then I guess the third one, bringing on the advisory team that we have a little bit earlier than I did. So making sure that it's not just about having dermatologists, it's about having dermatologists, public health advisors, health economic experts, folks that are involved in the system design of the NHS, having those people around the business nice and early. That I think is the third sort of foundation anyone should build their business on.
Amazing. And a follow-up question. The first thing you mentioned was the team. For founders who are non-technical and they can't build a product themselves, should they be thinking about, does it work to use an agency or outsource it to another country and just get a freelancer to design and ship it over to you? Does that work, or should you really be doubling down on finding that co-founder who can also build with you?
It depends on what it is that you're talking about. So if you're talking about out and out technology, you can outsource the MVP, because you as the founder should have a really clear vision of what the product is, and you're going to be right down in the detail of the product, and you can get other people to build that for you. That's not where your USP is. That's not your superpower. That is, building that capability as your company grows is essential, but it's not the most important thing. And I know that's flying in the face of all of the Silicon Valley. It should be a technical I don't think that's true. I think in healthcare, it's much more important to understand the problem you're trying to solve than it is to have the technology. I think it's not a commodity to build technology, but it's also not like it used to be, where it was the differentiating factor. But if you're talking about artificial intelligence, now that is a core competency. And if you outsource that, you're doing two things. One, you're not getting the best because you're giving it to someone else who's just going to try and repurpose something else that they've built. And two, you're not learning. And for us, the version that we released, every version that we've released, has been a significant improvement based on empirical data and learning what didn't work and how we can improve it. And if you're not down in that detail, you can't hope to be very good at what you're doing. So if you're an AI company and you don't have AI people at the heart of your business, you've got no chance of being an AI company. So I'd say, no, you don't need a technical co-founder if what you're doing isn't like us, clinical AI. If it is, then you need to make sure that you've got people in the business that are tied to the business and that are exceptional. And we've been so fortunate in the people that we've got in our company. We've got some real rock stars, including Jack, who's built our algorithms from the ground up. And, the devil's in the detail, and the results are, exceptional. I think our last performance report showed that we found 98.7% of all melanomas that we saw.
Insane.
Incredible. Which is incredible numbers.
No, impressive. And I think that is sound advice. The last question before we wrap up, and everyone's talking about it and you mentioned about it, kind of expansion, US, 30, 40, 50% of all global healthcare spend is in US. It's a massive market. Is that on the horizon? Are you looking to expand there, or do you want to kind of dominate the NHS scene? And no doubt, skin cancer is one way that benefits from kind of AI-powered clinical pathways. There are other diseases that will benefit from your insight and expertise. So keen to hear your thoughts around those, kind of the future.
Yeah, so I want every single patient across the NHS urgent skin cancer pathway to come through our platform. I think it'll save the healthcare system a lot of money, and it will help find more cancers faster and get better outcomes for patients. I'm convinced of that. And I think we'll be at about 20% of urgent skin cancer referrals by the end of the year. So I want us to get up to 100. But at the same time, we are looking to expand first across Europe, because we have a CE mark coming as an autonomous device in Europe as well. And then into the US, because there's such a need in the US for what we do that we can't ignore that. So we will definitely internationalize. But at the same time, we are expanding out our focus from skin cancer into more broadly into dermatology. And I have a big passion for anything that is high volume primary care based. So radiology is not our thing. There's plenty of great companies out there doing that. But things like ophthalmology that are high volume, or
Yeah.
whatever else it might be.
Mm.
I'd love to get into that one day, depending on who else is playing in this space. So definitely ambitions to expand beyond, although we'd have to change the name, expand beyond skin. But for now, focus is dermatology and some international expansion.
No, I think
Love
that's
it.
incredible. I think you've had an incredible journey today. I'm really excited for what you're doing. It's much needed, especially the startups and the founders who speak to in health. It has genuine kind of life-saving impact, and we're always rooting for our guests and the companies they're building. Thank you for sharing kind of your journey, the highs and lows. We're super excited to see where you go. Thank you, Neil.
Yeah, thanks, guys. And I just want to say, I think one of the big shifts in whether or not health tech is going to be successful in the UK comes from folks like you guys who have genuine interest in speaking and understanding about it, and then taking those learnings and making them more accessible to people who are
Yeah.
clinicians, who are worried about this or interested in this space, through to people thinking about starting companies. So
Yeah.
thanks, guys, because I think without the work that you do and without the sort of dissemination of all of this this information, I think we would be further behind than we are now. So
No,
thanks for
appreciate
that.
it.
Appreciate that. Thank you so much, Neil. Thank you.